Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're very in a broken world probably. Well, anyway, I think we have quite a bit of discussion on that. I want to switch a bit of the subject now. And so Susan, you worked in the State Department for so many years. You are such a experienced and seasoned diplomat on Sino-U.S. relations. So now Biden administration is already in power for over 6 months now, and now we had the Sino-U.S. Senior diplomat meet at Alaska, which is sort of surprised a lot of people. And now we recently, just about a week ago, we had the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, visited China in Tianjin. Actually, she visited Tianjin, the closest. We had other foreign minister came, but in the other different parts of a bit further of Beijing, but the U.S. actually got the closest to the Beijing city to meet. Minister Wang met her, and also Vice Minister Xie phone met him as well. So how do you interpret the last 6 months, the new Biden administration compared with the Trump administration on the relation on China? Because you worked at, you were acting deputy assistant of the state at Trump administration for until 2018. So
until things started to get really bad, that's when I left. So I can't be held responsible for the last couple of years of the Trump administration. But yeah.
That's right. I was saying you know both sides. But so why don't you give some analysis? Which I think we haven't got people that knows both sides to talk about that, particularly on the state level, state of secretary to visit.
So I think Ronnie's very pessimistic, and is mentioning that the U.S. is chosen to fall into the Thucydides trap. I guess I hope it's not that. I don't think it's that much of a plan, and I don't think it's that purposeful. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty and chaos in the Biden administration as they sort of inherit a lot of things from the Trump administration that are still being sorted out, obviously. They're trying to focus a lot on domestic issues. Foreign policy is definitely second fiddle. I think the Biden administration is looking to not have problems on the foreign policy front. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that, first of all, moving from the Trump administration's very sort of toxic, negative narrative on China to something more constructive is not going to happen overnight, just because of the psychology of the body politic and the sort of the narratives in the media, et cetera. So looking at that problem, you could see how, it would take quite a bit of time and effort to try to strategize and figure out how to change that, without giving people whiplash. The other thing I think is that the Trump narrative on China is useful for galvanizing, to some extent, domestic political backing for certain parts of Biden's program. And it's also a defensive move. And I just published a chapter in a book. The book is called Engaging China, the Last 50 Years of Sino-U.S. Relations. And it involved writers and authors who were there at the beginning, at the beginning of U.S.-China relations, and then are writing now and reflecting back on the engagement. But the chapter that I wrote with Ken Lieberthal at Brookings is about the transition between U.S. political administrations and how U.S.-China relations figures in that. And it's very typical in recent U.S. administrations that presidents come in, especially if it's a change of party, and they, have been very hard on China generally during the political campaign. And they have all kinds of wild ideas about things they're going to do, this and that, with respect to U.S.-China relations. We saw this under Reagan, believe it or not. We also saw it with Bill Clinton. We saw it with George W. Bush. Maybe not quite so much with Obama. But it is a fairly typical thing to see this kind of adjustment take place within the first year of a U.S. administration. And so, Biden's been at this for 6 months. He's got a lot on his plate. He knows the US-China relationship very well. And I have to think, especially after seeing his meeting with Putin and the way that he has spoken determinedly about having a meeting with President Xi, that he, sees himself as a leader in this relationship and wants to drive it in a direction that's going to be better. It's going to take, I think, more time. The couple meetings that we've had so far are not enough. China is certainly venting anger at, what's transpired over the last couple of years. And I just have to say, in fact, it's not quite fair because China did not vent anger during the Trump administration in the way that it's doing now with Biden. And it's actually the Trump administration that started all of this and did it in a very kind of, sort of chaotic way. But China was, so worried about Trump's chaos, it didn't dare say anything. So it's had all of this anger sort of built up over the last several years. And now that Biden comes in, who's a more reasonable person and a more, level-headed leader, they're sort of unloading on him because they know they can, because they know it's a more familiar and reliable kind of relationship, maybe. So, we have to see that for what it is as well. And I hope there will be a meeting of the two leaders. I know, with COVID, everything, we have to recognize too that COVID is playing a big part in this, in our poor communication, because it's very hard to meet. It was very hard to set up this meeting in Tianjin. It was very hard to set up the meeting in Anchorage. And it's very hard to get our two presidents together face to face in person in the same room right now. So I think we need to take a deep breath and maybe be a little bit more patient. I know China is not fully understanding all of the statements and things that the US is making, and I think that it's right for China to question that in private and maybe even in public, but to do it in a way that leaves open some space for us to sort of move this in a kind of a more low-key, gradual off-ramp direction.
Susan, I have a little bit slightly different take than what you have just said.
Good.
I don't think, your chapter with Ken, by the way, say hello to Ken. Your chapter with Ken, talks about the different administrations. But from the Chinese perspective, it's the United States of America. Whether it's this president, that president, is the United States of America. And America has been so strong that everybody has to play along with the American politics, and hence new administration, you react differently. But then from the Chinese perspective, as I see it, is that they were really bending backwards during the Trump times. It's not just because Trump was a crazy guy in US-China relations and many other things. China was really bending backwards, trying to build relationships, restore the relationship. And then they failed because Trump didn't want any part of it. And then they were hoping that Biden would be a little bit better, and Biden turned out to be no better. And as I said, some of us never believe that, Biden will turn better because the whole body politics in America has already been poisoned. But nonetheless, the Chinese thought that let's hope that Biden will turn better. Biden didn't. And as a result, the Chinese say, this is very consistent, irrespective. It doesn't matter what Susan and Ken Lieberthal have written about changing of administration. This administration is still going to go in the wrong direction as far as China is concerned. And hence, they are becoming tougher and tougher. And I agree with you, Susan. I hope that, there are two people fighting on the stage right now. In the past, there was one adult. That was China, not Trump, not the United States. And that's where I begin to worry. But let me also take another backward look. I think that what is changing today is a culmination of 30 years of relationship. In other words, by 1990, when the Soviet Union fell, and the United States began to see China in a very, very different light. As I told Henry Kissinger, I said, what you did in 1972, in some ways is very good. But the reason behind it is basically the presence of Soviet Union. And it's not strong enough, not good enough, a reason for it to last if Soviet Union is no longer a problem. Most of us didn't see Soviet Union collapsing. And when it collapsed in the early 1990s, the rationale for having better relationship dissipated. And so many of my friends, Paul Wolfowitz, for example, began to write white paper and this and that in 1992 about, the Pacific, that's really targeting China. So that relationship has been on the wane for 30 years. And so we are really not just looking at Trump and Biden. We should look at the last 30 years where relationships are on the downswing. It wasn't, when the Korean War came, the relationship dropped off the cliff. When Nixon went to China, the relationship overnight went to heaven. But this time, from 1990 onward, roughly, the relationship has been gradually trending down. And so what Trump did is just to kick it into hell, that's all. And then the whole body politics in America has been so poisoned vis-a-vis China. They say China is a threat. China is a threat to who? China is a threat not to the world. China is a threat to American supremacy, perhaps, in some areas. And so, and then as in any society, 95% of the population don't really understand these things or analyze these things. So if the president says that, hey, China is a bad guy, China is a bad guy, how many people really know enough to think through issues? And so, it's a very sad situation. I never thought that I will see the day when the U.S.-China relationship get to that bad a situation, and I don't foresee it getting better anytime soon, whether it is the Democrats or the Republicans.
Well, you mentioned the last 30 years, Ronnie. I mean, that exactly coincides with my time in the State Department, basically. I joined in 1991, the year that Soviet Union collapsed, and it went to the Soviet Union. But I agree with your fundamental observation that we really never had in the US, we would say, I don't know how the interpreter is going to translate this, but a come to Jesus moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think we never had that moment inside the United States either to figure out sort of what it was now after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the US was going to be doing in the world. I mean, you say the attitude was about US supremacy, but I don't think that inside the United States, there was no debate really. There was Frank Fukuyama's book about the end of history, and sort of everyone just kind of assumed that like everything would fall into place now and just go on. And they, were preoccupied with Europe, of course, and lots of other things, the Balkans. Then we moved into the Great War on Terror. And so it's just like never really sitting down and saying, okay, what is the purpose of our place in the world now? And really it coincided also with this rapid globalization. I mean, Henry, your center is about globalization, and Ronnie doesn't think that we should have the title globalization or interwoven world in the talk, but I want to come back to it because really the 90s was the decade of globalization, and we probably hit peak globalization around 2008 before the financial crisis, but we never updated the institutions. We never actually sat around and fundamentally kind of thought about how globalization changes the international discourse and the way countries are going to operate together. We never really did that. And now we're kind of grown up with this international system. China says UN Charter, but the UN Charter is not enough to serve us in a globalized world. It's not enough. We have to have rules and institutions around all these other things that are trans-border phenomena and transnational phenomena, and our systems don't fit together. So how are we going to do that? We've never really had that conversation, in my view. And so now China says, well, the US made all those rules, we don't want them. And the US says, well, China's trying to dump all the rules and impose its system on everyone. And so that's not a productive way of looking at the situation, actually, when you can see, looking back, how we got to here.
I'm fully with you, Susan, on that one. I think, on the side of, sorry, that you and I have probably in the camp of, and that is, wanting the world to be a more peaceful one and U.S.-China relationship develop in a better way. We really did not come up with a, whatever moment you call it, we did not really have an intellectual discussion that is nationwide in the United States. There's really not an intellectual discussion along that line. And then at the same time, you have people such as Donald Rumsfeld, such as Paul Wolfowitz, such as the vice president under whatever.
Cheney,
anyway,
yeah.
Cheney, they begin to, the neocons begin to, move briskly during that time. And I think that the globalization of the world after the fall of the Soviet Union blunted their advance somewhat. But then eventually they took the center stage. And today, whether it's Trump and even Biden, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would never imagine Biden taking the position that it does today vis-a-vis China. And so that tells you how that the whole political apparatus in America, and then with the media really influencing the society, has moved it in the wrong direction. And it's an aircraft carrier. Aircraft carrier cannot turn easily. And that's what I'm afraid that we are looking at.
No, I think both of you have actually given a very good, analysis of the situation. I think that this year actually marked 50 years of Dr. Kissinger's secret visit to China. We just had the webinar with him just about 20 days ago that celebrated his historical visit. And also, it's 20 years of China joining WTO and 30 years of ending the Cold War. That's where Susan started your diplomatic at the State Department diplomatic career. Very glorious. What I would like to say actually further, maybe put a little detail, because we had Deputy Secretary of State Ms. Sherman's visit to Tianjin. And then in that meeting, I think it's better than Alaska. Probably both sides now come up with some concrete list now, at least to say we have to, work down and see how we can resolve those differences. And of course, also that the Chinese has proposed, there's some ideas how we can really shut down, maybe some list of the controversy or things that the China don't want. But on the other hand, also the U.S. has proposed a list too. But ultimately, we hope that maybe, as Susan, you said, maybe it's this COVID-19 is not really helping. We need more frequency of the higher senior diplomatic visit, but also probably even top heads of the state visit, a meeting at the G20 if possible. But right after the meeting of Tianjin, Foreign Minister Qin Gang actually went to the United States and already arrived in Washington. So we hope that we can start a new, some concrete discussion on that. I noticed actually, yesterday, Steve Orlins, from National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, he wrote a piece at the South China Morning Post titled, "How the U.S. Can Craft a Bold and Positive China Agenda that Benefits All Americans." Basically, his op-ed, he said, let's revoke tariffs, let's revisit the curbs on the Chinese people, Chinese companies, and the media, engage constructively on human rights and international norms, fine-tune Taiwan policy, and ditch confrontation. The U.S. should not understate the benefit of constructive engagement brought to the American people. So it seems a very good op-ed, and he made a lot of recommendations. Relax the visas, relax student visit, and then maybe we should not confrontation so much. So Susan, what do you think? Maybe we follow a bit more concrete and things like we can revoke, like tariff and things like that. So maybe you could give some more insights on that, Susan, please.
Yeah, I mean, I am hopeful that, I mean, I wasn't so happy that frankly, that the notion of giving the US a list of demands was publicized, because I think that makes it then, politically harder in the US to do those things, not easier. It's good to keep, in US-China relations, it's good to keep some of those detailed issues for the closed door meeting. But so I hope that won't, it won't entrench the two sides demanding that the other side make the first move. I'm afraid that might be where we are now. And I do worry about that. We need somebody to do something that's a little bit, bold and shows leadership to try to get this thing unstuck. But I'm hopeful that these kind of, lists of issues, and certainly Wendy Sherman's meeting, both sides mentioned these areas for potential cooperation. Climate change has, of course, been one that has been mentioned frequently. It's going to be very hard, but I'm going to keep pushing it because it's inexcusable and will be a historical shame if we don't do it. And, there are other issues: Afghanistan, North Korea, Myanmar, I think were mentioned. So there are a number of areas where we can, find ways, hopefully, to cooperate. We're doing, joint negotiations still, I hope, with Iran, and I hope that it becomes more fruitful in the future than it's indicating right now. But we have to do these things together, and I hope we can sort of work toward something pragmatic like that after these meetings. But there's still there's a lot of politics swirling around in Washington, as Ronnie has, pointed out. And frankly, there's a lot of things happening also in Beijing. And, the domestic politics are really creating a lot of problems for both sides right now. And I think we do need to see some bold leadership in both capitals to try to get through this impasse. Maybe a little bit less worrying about, protecting your flank from this or that. I don't know how realistic that is. Maybe Ronnie has a view on that for how realistic it is in Beijing. It is difficult in Washington right now too. Biden's trying to get big spending bills through, and it's a difficult political environment for him. But I do think he wants to get the relationship with China in a better place. And so just knowing him and knowing his experience with China, even though he sounds tough, and he is tough, I think he's worried. Frankly, the biggest worry, and Ronnie, you talked about, who's threatening who and who's doing what to whom. And I mean, I think in the region, China's military buildup is causing concern, and that causes demand signals for U.S. involvement. And the U.S. is feeling, after Trump, a kind of over-exaggerated need to reassure people in the region that the U.S. is going to be there, and in the face of their insecurity coming from China's military buildup. But the real problem is the economy. The Americans, and Joe Biden also feels this, that it's really not clear the future shape of the international economy and the place of the U.S. and China in it is very cloudy right now, I think. And international businesses are feeling this. I think developed countries in general, who rely on sort of innovation and technology to be their engines of growth, are feeling this. And it's causing a lot of anxiety. And I think that the sort of feeling that there's an economic threat coming from China, and we can't make China understand why we feel this way is a real problem. So maybe I'll just stop there and see if you all have a reaction to that.
Well,
Yeah,
so
maybe I just, Ronnie, yes, please.
many years ago, I have a dear friend, a couple, and one party later I found out already wanted to divorce, and she didn't let it out, didn't let people know. But once in a great while, I got an inkling that, man, maybe she doesn't want this relationship to continue. And so she play along, and they were together. They go out to dinner. They take care of their family, their children or whatever. But in her heart, she was divorced already. And that's what I'm afraid is happening today, that the United States the body politic has decided that U.S.-China relationship is going to be a threat to vital American interests. And so we're going to have give them hell. We're going to divorce. But then on the surface, you cannot say it too loudly. So the Chinese were trying their best to keep a good relationship throughout the Trump eras and then into the Biden. In Hawaii, they met with Pompeo, right? And didn't go too well. And then the Chinese went to American soil twice. That shows you how desperate the Chinese are to want to get the relationship better. I'm sure Biden insisted that it has to be an American soil. So, okay, fine. The farthest place, first one is Hawaii under Trump. Now it's Alaska under Biden. So that, and as you know, in diplomacy, these kind of things matters, where you meet and who speaks first and this and that. And the Chinese are bending backwards to go over to American soil twice. And the Chinese in particular, perhaps, is a little bit even more sensitive than most people on these kind of protocol issues. And yet what they got was a Blinken that is almost as bad as a Pompeo as far as the Chinese are concerned. And that's why, they reacted, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. And so that really tells you that China wanted to have a better relationship, and that was perhaps the last straw that broke the camel's back, that Biden doesn't want it either. It's not going to change. And so the Chinese begin to react. And that reaction, and you say China military buildup, all the buildup is it's a reaction to what the United States have been doing. Stop streaming down the middle of the Taiwan Strait. Stop spying in the coastal regions and see if the Chinese will build up. If they had done that in the past, they probably would not have built up as much. And when you have a big country, which is the second largest economy in the world, the movie Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks, that was American, big ship that was hijacked by the Somalian pirates. Well, my question is, next time when the Chinese, they need energy from the Middle East, as we all know. Next time is not Captain Phillips. Next time is Captain Henry Wang. Then what happened? Do they call the Seventh Fleet? The Seventh Fleet was the one that sent the aircraft carrier to Taiwan Strait in 1990, outside of Taiwan Strait in 1996. And then in subsequent years, for the last 2.5 decades, increasing military presence by the United States in the neighborhood. Of course, America has a good excuse. Hey, it's for our allies. Well, China has not done anything to any of America's allies in Asia for how long? Even Taiwan, which, as far as I'm concerned, is part of China. Just read history. Even with Taiwan, Beijing has never had a problem since 1957 or 58 or something like that. And then America became very provocative, and then China has no choice but to react. So don't say the Chinese are, military buildup is very dangerous. And the same thing with South China Sea, but I won't go into all that stuff. But anyway, I think that, we are already way beyond that point. I think the United States is like that lady friend of mine from decades ago who wanted the divorce. It's just, you cannot say it out loud yet for whatever reason, the children's education or whatever, this and that. But on the other hand, I think it's really, really bad news as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I don't know, but I think we are the U.S.-China relations certainly going through an agonizing process. But we hope that it will be really, getting better maybe in the longer run. Because I recently we had a CCG has conducted a number of dialogues. We talked to the Graham Allison, Joseph Nye, Martin Wolf, Thomas Friedman, all of them. And also 2 days ago, 1 day ago, we talked with John Thornton and quite a few others. Well, I think they don't disagree that we shouldn't have a Cold War. I mean, U.S. and China, there was an adjustment period. I mean, Joseph and I said maybe by 2035, when we look back, we probably can maybe repair the relation and then maybe get back to some kind of normalcy. We need a little bit longer horizon to look at that. So Susan, I know that you worked in the Consul General in Chengdu. It's unfortunate we shut that down. I mean, and then U.S. shut down the Houston. Yeah. So maybe you could give some further advice on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've heard quite a few people say that it's okay. Take quite a long time for U.S.-China relations to shake out this time. That we're going to go through a cycle of maybe, 10 years of a downturn. But I really think that we cannot afford to have that happen, because what's going to happen if we have this divorce that Ronnie's talking about, or even a divorce without the formality of divorce, but just basically a bifurcation or a separation. I mean, it's gonna impact the international system, and we've got globalization now, so we need an international system. And it's so I'm not really convinced that we're going to be able to get along in the sort of globalized. I mean, we've passed peak globalization. I agree with Ronnie about that, but there are certain elements of globalization that are not going to turn back, and those still need to be governed by some kind of international discourse and system that goes beyond just the UN Charter. And I think, look at all these transnational law enforcement cases. These are extremely difficult for governments to work on together, particularly the US and Chinese governments. They've always been difficult, but they're impossible right now. We're just going to let these transnational criminals run rampant because the US and China can't talk to each other. We need to have some kind of institutions that, can generate consensus among countries, and where we can sort of try to fit our systems together. All countries interfere in other countries' internal affairs. We have embassies in those, countries, and they're always doing this kind of stuff, monitoring what's going on there, lobbying the governments. We're trying to influence each other constantly. And in a globalized world, this is just going to be a fact of life. And so we've got to figure out what is the real problem here. What are the rules by which we can sort of regulate this? And how can we fit our systems together more seamlessly on both the economic front, because we absolutely need to do that. The first and second largest economies in the world, and we're not going to have trade. I don't believe it. So, that's going to have to be worked out. But also all these other areas where we have overlapping and transnational boundary issues, migration, crime, cyber, space, all of these other areas, pandemics, health, transportation, mobility, people movement back and forth. This isn't going to stop just because the US and China aren't getting along. Even during the Soviet Union, when we had a very major estrangement between the US and the Soviet Union, we still had people flows and some trade back and forth. So, and I want to just repeat again that China is not the Soviet Union. I wonder, Ronnie, if you have a comment on that.